Sarah to manage the home life on her own. At first, Sarah didn't mind the long hours. She had always been a social butterfly and enjoyed the time she had to herself during the evenings. But over time, the loneliness started to creep in. The house felt empty when the kids were at school and Charles was at work. Her days, once filled with activities and meetings with other mothers, began to feel monotonous. The quiet hum of the neighborhood became a constant reminder of how much she missed the excitement and attention that she once had. It was during one of these quieter days that Sarah first met Richard Walker, the man who would change her life forever. Richard had recently moved into the house next door. He was in his early 40s, tall, handsome, and exuded an air of mystery that immediately intrigued Sarah. Unlike the other men in the neighborhood, Richard was different. He wasn't caught up in the competitive hustle of suburbia, constantly boasting about his job or his family. Instead, he had an aura of calm confidence, a man who had already achieved everything he wanted and wasn't interested in the rat race. His house was sleek, modern, and furnished in a way that reflected his wealth and taste for the finer things in life. Their first encounter was nothing more than a friendly chat over the garden fence, but something about Richard lingered in Sarah's mind long after the conversation ended. He was not just charming but also thoughtful, asking questions about her life in a way that made her feel seen and appreciated. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent. They would exchange pleasantries as they both took their children to school or ran errands. Richard's friendly demeanor and attentiveness started to make Sarah feel special in a way she hadn't felt in years. Soon, Richard began inviting Sarah over for coffee, a harmless gesture at first. He spoke about his travels, his business ventures, and the different places he had lived. Sarah found herself drawn to his stories, fascinated by his experiences and the way he viewed the world. There was a freedom in his lifestyle that she envied, and the more she learned about him, the more she felt a yearning to break free from her own routine. It wasn't long before those innocent coffee dates turned into private dinners, just the two of them. And as the days passed, Sarah found herself becoming more and more intrigued by the man next door. Sarah couldn't deny that something inside her had shifted. She had always been content in her marriage, or at least she thought she had been, but now there was this undeniable pull towards Richard that she couldn't ignore. She was starting to question everything, her marriage, her role as a mother, and the life she had so carefully constructed. It was a dangerous and intoxicating feeling, one that would ultimately lead her down a path she never expected. As weeks passed, Sarah's encounters with Richard grew more frequent and increasingly intimate. What had started as casual coffee breaks and casual conversations over the fence blossomed into something more. The initial thrill of their connection quickly deepened, and Sarah began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: excitement. Richard's presence in her life was like a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the monotony of her daily routine. He seemed to see her in a way that Charles, with all his good intentions, no longer did. Richard paid attention to the little details, remembering things Sarah had mentioned offhandedly, and showing genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. It wasn't long before their meetings took a more secretive turn. Richard, with his knowing smile and smooth charm, began to find ways to spend time alone with her. It started with harmless outings: drinks at a local cafe, a visit to an art gallery, a quiet dinner at an upscale restaurant. Sarah justified these excursions as nothing more than innocent fun, a much-needed escape from the pressures of family life. But as the moments spent together grew more intimate, so did the emotions Sarah had been trying to suppress. She began to feel a connection to Richard that was far beyond friendship. The conversation started to shift from surface-level topics to more personal ones. Richard spoke of his travels, his career, and his past relationships, always with a sort of casual confidence that made Sarah feel both admired and understood. Richard never made her feel judged or criticized. With him, Sarah didn't have to be the perfect wife or mother. She could just be herself. She found herself talking to him in a way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. Richard was a master at making her feel special, offering compliments and words of encouragement that made her feel desirable and alive, in a way Charles had long since stopped doing. At the same time, his attention to detail, his ability to listen and ask the right questions, made Sarah feel seen in a way that had been missing from her marriage. And then, one evening after a particularly romantic dinner where Richard had gone out of his way to make Sarah feel like the most important person in the room, their connection escalated. The lingering glances, the charged silences, the soft touches on the arm, they all culminated in a single fateful moment. They kissed. The kiss was electric, a sudden rush of passion that seemed to erase all the doubts and fears Sarah had been harboring. The world outside seemed to disappear, and in that moment Sarah was no longer the dutiful wife or the overworked mother. She was simply Sarah, a woman who had been swept up in the excitement of an affair that felt like a fresh start, an escape from everything that had once felt confining. After that night, things between Sarah and Richard shifted. The boundaries between them blurred, and their relationship grew more intense. They began to see each other more frequently, often under the cover of night when the rest of the world was asleep and unaware of their secret. Sarah found herself lying to Charles more and more, coming up with excuses for why she had to stay out late or why she was too tired to go out with him. At first she felt guilty for betraying her husband, guilty for letting herself fall into this forbidden affair. But the guilt soon faded as the thrill of their encounters took over. Richard made her feel things she had forgotten she could feel: desire, excitement, passion, and she couldn't help but crave more. With every meeting, Sarah found herself drifting further from her marriage, her thoughts consumed by Richard. She couldn't stop herself from thinking about him, imagining what life could be like if she were with him instead of Charles. The more time she spent with Richard, the more discontent she became with her own life. She began to see Charles's neglect as a personal failure on his part. His long hours at the office, his inability to show her the attention she craved. She started to wonder if she had made a mistake, marrying a man who could never truly fulfill her needs. The idea of starting over with Richard began to take root in her mind, a possibility that seemed to offer everything she had ever wanted. But as Sarah's feelings for Richard deepened, so did the danger. She knew deep down that what they were doing was wrong. She was betraying the man she had promised to spend her life with, and even though she convinced herself that she deserved happiness, the guilt would occasionally creep in. Still, Richard continued to feed her desire for more, telling her that she deserved everything she ever dreamed of. Sarah was starting to believe him. The allure of a new life, a life with Richard, seemed more and more irresistible with each passing day. As Sarah's affair with Richard progressed, cracks began to form in her once stable life. The secrecy of their meetings weighed heavily on her, yet the thrill of living in a double life was something she couldn't resist. She had always prided herself on being a devoted wife and mother, but now her devotion seemed to fade as her feelings for Richard deepened. The guilt of betraying Charles had slowly turned into justification. After all, wasn't she entitled to happiness? Didn't she deserve to feel desired and appreciated? Charles, on the other hand, began to sense that something was wrong. He wasn't blind to the changes in Sarah. At first, he chalked it up to stress, to the normal ups and downs of marriage. Sarah had always been a doting wife, and the thought of infidelity never even crossed his mind. But when their interactions started to feel more distant, when she became distracted and distant during conversations, Charles couldn't ignore the growing unease. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the fact that she seemed to be less interested in him than she had been before, all of these things began to add up. Charles wasn't the type to pry, but he knew something was wrong. He began to pay closer attention, noticing how Sarah seemed to avoid him when he tried to initiate conversation or affection. The once constant phone calls where they would chat about their days grew sparse. When he did manage to get Sarah on the phone, her responses were curt, distant. It wasn't like her at all. At first, Charles assumed she was just tired, stressed out by the demands of taking care of the kids and the house. But as the weeks went by, his suspicions grew. He began to question her routine. When she said she was out for coffee with a friend, he would check the time, and the time alone didn't seem to add up. She had become far more secretive, and her excuses for not being home on time were beginning to feel rehearsed. It was a change he couldn't ignore, even though he wanted to. He wanted to believe that nothing was wrong, that he was just overthinking things. But the more he noticed, the more he realized that something was amiss. Then came the private investigator. In a moment of uncertainty, Charles decided to take action. He hired someone to follow Sarah to gather information that could either confirm or alleviate his fears. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was going on behind his back, and he needed to know the truth. What he learned only fueled his suspicions. The investigator provided Charles with photos of Sarah meeting Richard at a nearby park, their heads bent together laughing at something, clearly enjoying each other's company. Then there were photos of them dining at a quiet, upscale restaurant late into the evening, their body language suggesting a deeper connection than just friendship. The images confirmed what Charles had feared. The woman he loved had been hiding something from him. The betrayal was right in front of him, but the pain of seeing the truth was almost unbearable. Charles confronted Sarah, hoping to find an explanation, some kind of justification that could ease the betrayal he felt. He tried to remain calm, to approach the situation with understanding, but when Sarah remained silent, avoiding eye contact, Charles's anger began to bubble to the surface. He asked her directly if there was someone else. She didn't respond immediately, and in that pause, Charles saw the answer in her eyes, the look of guilt, the hesitation. It was all there, unspoken but undeniable. Sarah finally admitted the truth. She confessed that she had been seeing Richard for months, that what had started as an innocent friendship had grown into something far more complicated. She explained that Richard had shown her a world of excitement and passion that she hadn't known she was missing. In a way, she told Charles, she had felt alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. It was hard for her to explain, but she felt trapped between two worlds, the life she had built with Charles and the life that Richard offered. She knew she had hurt him, but she couldn't help the way she felt. The revelation was a gut punch to Charles. The love of his life, the woman he had built a family with, had been living a lie for months. And as the pieces began to fall into place, Charles started to realize how much he had taken for granted in their marriage. He had been so focused on his career, on building their life together, that he hadn't seen the distance growing between them. He had neglected Sarah in ways he never thought possible. The conversation ended in a quiet, painful silence. Sarah, overwhelmed with guilt, left the room, and Charles was left to confront the truth. Their marriage, once a foundation of trust, had been shattered. What began as a simple affair had turned into something far more devastating, and Charles couldn't help but feel that his entire world had come crashing down around him. But even as the truth surfaced, Richard was already plotting his next move, and Sarah, entangled in a web of guilt and confusion, was now facing a decision that would change everything. The revelation of Sarah's affair with Richard sent shockwaves through the Smith household. Charles, broken and betrayed, struggled to process the truth. The foundation of his entire life, the home he had worked so hard to build, the family he loved, had been shattered in a single moment. He couldn't understand how Sarah, the woman he had loved for over a decade, could betray him in such a devastating way. His first instinct was to try and save their marriage, to salvage whatever was left of their life together. But as the days dragged on, Charles began to realize that he could no longer ignore the distance that had grown between them. The damage was done, and even though Sarah seemed remorseful, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Meanwhile, Sarah was consumed by guilt. She didn't know what she expected when she confessed to Charles, but it certainly wasn't the pain and devastation she saw in his eyes. She had expected anger, yes, but not this crushing sense of loss. She had betrayed him, yes, but in doing so, she had also destroyed the only life she had ever known. The affair with Richard had been an escape, a way to feel alive again, but now it had become a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Still, despite the guilt gnawing at her every waking moment, Sarah found herself drawn to Richard more than ever. Richard had become the person she turned to for comfort, someone who had shown her a world she could barely have imagined. He had promised her freedom, excitement, and a life of luxury beyond what Charles could offer. The thought of leaving Charles, of starting over with Richard, had begun to feel inevitable. Sarah had begun to believe Richard's version of events, that Charles was no longer the man she needed him to be, and that the only way forward was to sever ties and start a new chapter. Richard, for his part, had always been manipulative, but now he took things a step further. He told Sarah that she deserved better, that she had been living a life of restraint for too long, bound by the responsibilities of being a wife and mother. He convinced her that the only way she could truly be happy was to break free from the shackles of her old life, to embrace a future with him. The idea of a fresh start, of a life without the weight of guilt and obligation, became an intoxicating fantasy she couldn't resist. But as Sarah's resolve to leave Charles grew stronger, something more sinister began to unfold. Richard's intentions were never as pure as Sarah had believed. Richard wasn't just after a fresh start. He was after control. It became clear to him that in order to fully have Sarah, he needed to eliminate any obstacles in their path. He had been patient, carefully cultivating a sense of dependency in Sarah, convincing her that she was nothing without him. But now the situation had changed. Richard knew that as long as Charles was alive, Sarah would continue to be torn between her old life and the promise of a new one. Richard wasn't about to let that happen. Late one evening, Richard planted the idea in Sarah's mind. He told her that Charles had to go, that the only way to fully break free and be together was for her to take drastic action. He spun a story about how dangerous it could be for Sarah to remain in unhappy marriage, how Charles might try to use his wealth and power to take their children away from her. Richard painted a picture of an uncertain future for Sarah unless she made the ultimate decision to sever ties completely. He spoke of how much she deserved better, how she deserved to live freely, and that the path to that freedom was clear. Charles had to be removed from the equation. Sarah, still reeling from the guilt of her affair, found herself in an emotional whirlwind. She wanted to believe that Richard was right, that leaving Charles was the only way forward. The more Richard spoke, the more convinced Sarah became that there was no other choice. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew quickly in her mind. What had once been a romantic escape now seemed like a necessity, something she had to do for her own survival and for her future with Richard. That night, Sarah's world turned upside down. Richard arranged to meet her at her house after Charles had left for a late work meeting. They would finally make a plan for Sarah to leave, to start fresh. But in the back of Sarah's mind, the words Richard had said haunted her. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the only way to truly be free from her old life and to ensure that nothing would ever come between her and Richard was for Charles to be permanently out of the picture. The thought made her stomach turn, but it also felt like the only option left. As she paced the quiet house that evening, waiting for Richard to arrive, Sarah realized that her world had been slowly slipping from her control. She had already made so many choices that had led her to this point, and now one final decision loomed over her, a decision that would seal her fate and change everything forever. She couldn't take it back. The path she had set herself on seemed unavoidable now, and there was no turning back. The quiet, peaceful home she once shared with Charles suddenly felt cold and oppressive. A place where the love she once knew had been replaced by something darker and more dangerous. The night had fallen thick and quiet around the Smith household, the kind of silence that always felt heavy when something crucial was about to happen. Sarah sat in the dimly lit living room, nervously twisting her fingers in her lap. Her thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. Tonight was the night. Richard had made it clear that they needed to act, and Sarah, despite her hesitation and her lingering sense of guilt, was ready to follow through. She had convinced herself that this was the only way to move forward, that she had no other choice. The idea of starting over with Richard was the only thing that kept her going. Charles had left for a meeting just as he had done so many times before, but tonight it felt different. His absence no longer felt like a reprieve. Instead, it was the moment of opportunity. Richard was supposed to arrive soon, and together they would plan Sarah's escape. Richard had always been persuasive, and over the past months, he had ingrained in Sarah the belief that this was her chance to free herself from a life she no longer recognized. The thought of leaving Charles, leaving everything she had known, still made her feel uneasy, but it had become an overwhelming compulsion. It was her future with Richard that mattered now, wasn't it? The doorbell rang, and Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She stood quickly, smoothing her clothes and wiping her hands on her pants. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before crossing the living room to open the door. There he was, Richard, standing in the doorway with a look of urgency in his eyes. He stepped inside without a word, his presence filling the room like a force of nature. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice smooth, calm. Sarah nodded, though the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest like a ton of bricks. She had spent so much time justifying this moment, convincing herself it was the right thing to do. But now that it was here, the reality of the situation felt more overwhelming than she had expected. Richard didn't waste time. He had a plan, one that he had been carefully crafting for weeks. He had done his research on Charles, and he knew the right buttons to push. He was convinced that this would be the final step in securing their future together. It was clear to Sarah now that Richard had always intended for things to go this far. It wasn't just about love, it was about control. He had never truly cared for her the way she had believed. But Sarah was too deep into the affair to see it now. She had convinced herself that Richard was her salvation, that he would be the one to give her the life she had longed for. In a quiet voice, Richard explained that Charles needed to be dealt with. The idea of confrontation seemed inevitable, even if it scared Sarah. Richard told her that he had already taken care of everything. He was sure that after tonight, their lives would be changed forever. No more secrets, no more lies. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she tried to steady her breath. She wanted to believe that Richard's plan was the way forward. She wanted to believe that once this was over, she and Richard could finally be together, living the life that had been promised to her. But as the tension built, a sudden wave of clarity washed over Sarah. Something in her gut told her that this was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. This wasn't freedom. It was the beginning of a nightmare. But it was too late. The door opened again and Sarah froze. Charles had come back early, something that rarely happened. His eyes widened in shock as he stepped into the house, his gaze darting between Sarah and Richard. The tension in the room thickened in an instant.